Go ahead.
All right, so good morning, everyone, and I hope you're not hearing, but the leaf blowers are doing their dance outside my window. Apologies if there's background noise. I spent last week with you talking about what happened and didn't happen in Glasgow, Scotland at COP26 with what I view as slow progress in humanity's effort to reckon and come to grips with, develop the will and capacity to cope with climate change. And it's funny, I was just listening to a show on the radio about what one sentence message would you send to a future civilization if our civilization doesn't make it, right? And in a sense, the takeaway of my lecture is unless we really speed up our efforts to decarbonize our economy, unless we develop the domestic will to assist the less developed countries in the world in transitioning to modern society and economy without the kind of emissions that we are guilty of having put into the atmosphere over the last 150 years, frankly, that radio show is talking about the right thing. We're not going to make it. What lessons do we learn from the dismal failure of the human species to solve its most urgent existential problem? And I concluded by saying that's an awful, truly terrible thing to have to reckon with, but it's also honest, and we need to say it loudly and clearly and often in the hopes that if we are clear-eyed enough about it, we will eventually develop the will capacity. And when I say eventually, next year, the year after, we don't have a lot of time. And then I concluded by saying I would try to do something a little bit more hopeful with you this week. And I am going to actually probably spend the next few lectures exploring what I see as a really important tension in contemporary American politics. And that has to do with the short as opposed to the long-term perspective. And as the title conveys, I think the short-term perspective is rather dismal. As a matter of fact, in ways that I'll suggest to you today, I think that there are growing forces that imperil American democracy. But I also believe that there are good grounds for long-term hope about the United States becoming a more just and more functional democracy, and that we need to keep those two in balance as we figure out how to navigate the short-term threats, but also how to sustain hope in light of what is likely to be a very turbulent decade in American politics. So that's the overall objective for this in the next lecture. I am sorry to say that I'm not going to jump right in because there's stuff in the news that I do want to talk with you about. And it's funny, I don't quite know what to lead with, but I think I am going to lead with the verdict in the Kyle Rittenhouse trial in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where this young man was found to be not guilty on all charges having to do with his having brought an automatic weapon to a protest, a riot, looting, and in the end, having killed 2 individuals and shot a third. And the issue that I'm going to focus on is not purely the legal issue. And I'll start by saying, I think this may in fact have been correctly decided. And in saying that, I recognize that many of us are rightfully both angry and scared in a scenario in which a 17-year-old boy can bring an assault rifle into the middle of a conflict situation and kill 2 people, and the law correctly holds him not guilty, right? But having said that, I think we have to bear in mind, we are a country of laws, not people. We have a foundational commitment to the rule of law. Among our principles is that there's a burden of proof on the prosecution that the accused is not guilty until proven beyond a reasonable doubt that they are guilty. And that the standards of self-defense, especially as they're formulated in Wisconsin currently, are relatively permissive, and that unfortunately, none of Kyle Rittenhouse's actions up until the point where he pulled the trigger are illegal, right? And so we have not perfect laws. We have an imperfect judicial system in ways I'm about to try to spell out to you. But having said that, we have to enforce the laws that are on the book until we reform them. We have to rely on our judicial system until we reform it. And in light of those circumstances, this was an understandable, maybe even the correct decision. But we need to put it in historical context. And so I want to start by suggesting to you that Rittenhouse is performing from a script that has a long history in the United States. And it is a script of legally authorized white vigilante racial violence, right? And this is there in the slave laws that allow any white person to kill or apprehend anyone that they believe is an escaped slave. And you've probably seen 6 Years a Slave. You know that oftentimes that resulted in white violence against African Americans who were not in fact escaped slaves, but it also was an aspect of white citizenship, of white freedom, the ability to use violence to maintain racial subordination, right? And then after slavery was abolished in the Jim Crow South, a series of laws were passed called the Black laws that allowed whites to, again, police the racial order themselves and maintain racial subordination. This is directly related to the long history of lynching in the United States, the thousands of people who were killed in ritual displays of violence, sometimes as frequently as one every other day. And these were celebrations of white power inflicted on Black bodies. You're well aware that Hastings Law School, the University of California at San Francisco Law School, is in the middle of a conflict because it turns out that the man that it's named after was himself guilty of white vigilante violence against Native Americans. We see this represented in some of our favorite movies and Westerns, where it's often the case that the good white cowboys are fighting against the black-hatted Mexican banditos and the Native Americans, right? And we lionize this. This is heroic display of rugged American individualism. Never mind that it is also unjust racial violence and oppression. And so when we look at the script that probably somebody like Rittenhouse is following, and don't get me wrong, I do want to defend the principles of the rule of law and trial by jury and following the law within that system. Having said that, I don't think that the outcome of this trial will be salutary for American politics. I think quite to the contrary. Rittenhouse is very likely to become a hero of the American right, and it's likely to encourage more people to take to the streets with deadly force in their hands to be vigilante enforcers of what they see as law and order, right? And so viewed in that first historical perspective, I think we have to recognize that there's a problem with the laws in the United States, and this rapid amplification of the right to bear arms, beginning with the Supreme Court decision that made it an individual right. And then as state after state has passed laws that make open carry, concealed carry, stand your ground, the castle doctrine that you can shoot someone if they enter your home, right? That we are permitting more and more violence in our society. And I've shared with you the findings of Jonathan Metzl, the public health doctor, who in his book, Dying from Whiteness, documents that in the states with the most libertarian gun laws, the primary victims of gun violence are the owners of the guns and their families, and that this is primarily a problem for white people, right? That they're turning the guns on themselves in moments of desperation. We need to reform these laws. We need to recognize that violence is epidemic in our society, and that we are moving into a period with a high risk of heightened political violence. And unfortunately, I think the Rittenhouse verdict, although the right verdict perhaps, is going to contribute to a trend that risks spiraling out of control. So then the second perspective I want to place this in is the new era of political violence that I believe we're at the very dangerous risk of entering, and may in fact in historical retrospect conclude we have already entered. And with it, the erosion of democratic norms. And the fundamental norm here is that we settle our political differences peacefully through so-called paper bullets, that is to say, through ballots, not through rocks, stones, and guns. That we have elections, that we make laws, that we're not always going to agree, but that at the end of the day, we agree to peacefully resolve our disagreements through electoral democracy. And it seems to me that in the 21st century, there's been a dangerous erosion of that commitment. And of course, it has coincided with the United States becoming a much more diverse, multiracial democracy. So exactly the issues that were at stake at that night in Kenosha 2 years ago, when Kyle Rittenhouse ultimately shot people, are the issues that are leading to the escalating political violence in the American political system. And so I want to start with the obvious, but the honest. And I think people on my side of the political perspective spectrum need to acknowledge this. There was looting and rioting occurring in Kenosha, Wisconsin. It was out of control, and it was part of a problem that wasn't confined to Kenosha. It was occurring in Seattle and Portland and other cities as well. And right, I don't know how much of the backstory you know in Kenosha, but the police had shot an African-American man who was unarmed and who ultimately survived but was paralyzed. And so the protests erupted there as a result of the perception that the kind of police violence that led to the death of George Floyd, ultimately what we can now call the murder of George Floyd by the police not too far from Kenosha, Wisconsin, was repeating itself in Kenosha, and the frustration in ways that I'll document to you in just a moment, with the long-standing patterns of racial injustice in the American criminal justice and police system, but that it did spiral out of control, and that there were bad elements in Kenosha. And to be as clear about this as possible, I want to start by noting that if we compare the Black Lives Matters protests of the summer of 2020 with the protests of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and the 1960s, the fact that our protest movements are organized on social media has radically reduced the cost of organizing these protests, but thereby has also reduced the organizational capacity of the people organizing them. And so the likelihood that these protests are potentially going to spin out of control, I think, is greater, given the more the skeletal organizational structure that gives rise to them, the lack of capacity of leaders to discipline those who come to the streets in particular. And so in a sense, this is something we have to acknowledge, and something that is a fact of contemporary American protest politics worldwide. It's driven by social media. Social media, it allows for rapid transmission of ideas, rapid organization of protests, but also diminishes organizational capacity and allows for the circulation of disinformation. And so it's a complicated new terrain with lots of risks, and some of those risks were present in Kenosha that night. Having said that, I want to quickly pivot to what I think is by far and away the larger threat to political violence, or of political violence in American society right now. And that's the growing support for political violence, primarily on the political right. And I've spoken with you about this before. I want to present you again some of the evidence of this, but I do want to just note that although the decision is correctly decided, right, the verdict is correct, it may nevertheless be lamentable in terms of the way it's going to spill out into the broader politics of America, in terms of the way in which Kyle Rittenhouse may be held up as a model for vigilante political empowerment for a group of people who feel increasingly little agency and increasingly alienated in American politics and society. And it may also give rise to or reinforce a sense of impunity, that you can bring guns to protest, shoot people, and ultimately not be convicted, and in fact be celebrated, is not what American democracy needed right now, even if it is the correct decision. So now turning to right-wing political violence and what seems to me to be the big threat. Some of this I've shared with you before. This is the most recent survey that I've seen on this topic. It's from just a month ago. And what it shows, and this is the American Values Survey. It's one of the gold standard surveys of American public opinion. That how many Americans agree with the following statement: true American patriots might have to resort to violence in order to save our country, right? And what you can see is nearly 20% of people agree with that statement right now. 1 in 5 people, right? So when we talk about this being a combustible political environment, that is clearly, I think, what we have to be concerned about. Then we break it down, right? How many of these people are on the right? How many of these people are on the left? How many are Republican? How many are Democrats? It is 30% of Republicans, 11% of Democrats. So basically a 3-to-1 ratio of Republicans to Democrats. It's, I would say, very disturbing to have 10% of people believe that violence might be necessary to save our society, when we have at least a minimally functional democracy, regular, fair, open elections, right? But when we've got 30% of one political party agreeing with that statement, there's something more systematic going on here, right? And so what is it? I think it's in part the political party itself. The Republican Party increasingly endorses fantasies of using violence to restore order. We saw this in the censure motion in the House of Representatives this week. It's in part the takeover of the Republican Party by Donald Trump, a man who seems to have no scruples in celebrating somebody like Rittenhouse or encouraging a mob to invade Congress in order to disrupt American democracy. But in addition to the fact that this is concentrated in the Republican Party, we can also see, I think, another extremely important factor here, and that has to do with media diet. And as you can see, among the Republicans, those who trust mainstream media, it's only about 20% only, right? It's 50% lower than the rate for Republicans as a whole. Those who watch Fox News or most trust Fox News, it's up at 32%. Those who most trust far right news sources, it's up at 40%. And so the media environment is clearly encouraging violence in politics at this historical moment. By the way, those who think that the election was stolen, 40% of them favor the idea that we might have to use violence. 30% believe that the country has changed so much that they feel like strangers in their own country. You'll hear the echo of Arlie Hochschild's work in that statement. She seems to have put her finger on something prevalent and important. And that takes us back, of course, to the racial dimension of all of this. This is an earlier study that shows that a substantial proportion of Americans think that the election was stolen from Donald Trump, that a smaller proportion thinks that force would be justified to restore Trump to the presidency. And when we look at that group in more detail, 63% of them say that African-American or Hispanics in our country will eventually have more power than whites. And this is the great replacement theory. And so when we drill down on the 30% in favor or who will consider using violence, right, in order to save our country, the 30% who say it's changed so much that it no longer feels like their country, I think there's a clear racial subtext to this. They are concerned that they are being replaced, right? So I now want to put this in a different context, and I'm sorry to share this image with you again. It's an awful image, but let us remember for a moment what the impetus to the protests in the summer of 2020 were, and that was the police murder of George Floyd, captured on film in all its gruesome, awful detail for everyone to see. And let us remember that this was not a single isolated incident. It was followed on months later by a shooting in Kenosha, but it was also following hundreds of documented police killings of unarmed African Americans over the last decade, right? And too many names to list here. It gave rise then to these protests throughout the country. And I think it's worthwhile noting that there was a mass eruption of protest politics that really we had not seen the likes of since the height of the civil rights movement. And that this was not just an urban coastal Black phenomenon. Yes, there was a high concentration of these protests in the coastal cities, but it was really spread throughout the country. And I like to make my jokes about my maps of the United States. This one looks like the US has measles, right? There are protests in all white cities. In many of these protests, whites are in the majority, or at least joining forces with African Americans, with Latinos, with Asian Americans. This is a genuine, sustained, large movement of protest politics that looks like it may finally call attention to the problems of racial injustice in the criminal justice system in the United States and lead to lasting reform, right? So that's the summer of 2020, the moment in which, right, Rittenhouse goes to Kenosha. And I just want to point out to you very quickly, these are images from those protests. The vast majority of those protests were peaceful, right? They were moments to witness grief. They were moments to express hope. I love this image of the little Black girl joined by, it appears to be a white man. He's mainly off camera except for his hands, and she's looking up at him. And the sign, of course, says, "This is everyone's fight." And then this image as well. That one's from Culver City, California. This one is from Hartford, Connecticut, of police joining hands with the protesters. This is the dominant form these politics took. And I emphasize that there are riots, there is looting, there is a lack of discipline and control, but the vast majority of these protests were in fact peaceful, disciplined, controlled, interracial, and moments for America to really return to its core principles. All men are created equal and have certain inalienable rights endowed by their creator. Right among those is the right to a fair criminal justice system, right? And it is so clear that we don't have one now. I'll say more in a moment, but I do want to point out then for a moment what was happening in Kenosha on the night Kyle Rittenhouse went there. That's a police warehouse going up in flames. This is the car lot that Rittenhouse went to with friends to try to protect it from rioting and looting. And this is obviously lawless. And I want to be as careful as possible. I believe the really important asymmetry between the two parties on this is that the Democrats have been absolutely clear in condemning violence when it is used in these kinds of events, right? And that we do need to say there's no room, there's no place for this. Yes, we understand the anger. Yes, we understand the frustration. Yes, we understand the long simmering resentment and the fear and the way in which it is hard to contain that. But having said that, we cannot move from that to understanding, let alone condoning violence when it occurs. But having said that, it does not help the situation when armed amateurs come to these protests to confront these protesters, to display openly their threat. It is clear that this is a provocation, right? And so if we don't want situations like this to occur again, we have to do two things. We have to change our laws so that our criminal justice system is fair. And we have to change our laws so that it's not legal for 17-year-olds to come with assault rifles to protest politics, right? That's just a recipe for an incendiary event. So with that in mind, I now want to talk a little bit, and this will be a refresher. I'll move pretty quickly about what the protesters in Kenosha and in the summer of 2020 were protesting. And I'm going to start by referring you to the wonderful, transformative book by Michelle Alexander, The New Jim Crow: Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. And just to ponder for a moment the meaning of the title. The claim behind Alexander's book is that after the Supreme Court, after the United States, in response to the civil rights movement, lawsuits, protests, the unsustainability of Jim Crow segregation, disenfranchisement, and vigilante violence, after it was abolished, right? That this did not dismantle the system of white supremacy in the United States, the system of racial order that privileges whites over blacks, and that one of the ways in which the racial order of the United States is maintained is by maintaining the threat of unpredictable, lawless violence against African Americans. And that with the dismantling of Jim Crow, that violence has in many ways been transferred to the police and the criminal justice system, that it is the implicit enforcer of racial hierarchy in the United States in 21st century. And so with that thesis in mind, I'd ask you to look at some of the data that people like Alexander adduce to support that claim. The first starts with the likelihood that African Americans are going to be killed by the police in an ordinary encounter between the police and a civilian. 3 times as likely as white people, despite the fact that they are less likely to be armed and so less likely to present a lethal threat. I've spoken with you before about Jennifer Eberhardt of Stanford University, a psychologist, the person who invented the term implicit bias, and who's done some of the most interesting work on this, along with Jennifer Richardson of Yale University, both MacArthur Fellows, both leaders in social psychology focused on race. And Eberhardt has recently done some work that I think is really fascinating. She took a team of linguists and ordinary people and asked them to look at transcripts and listen to tapes that come out of the body cameras that the police are now wearing in many jurisdictions. Not ubiquitous, unfortunately, but in many jurisdictions they are now wearing body cams. And so we have a recording of many of their ordinary interactions with the motorists they pull over. And so she asked both linguists and ordinary people to rate the interactions without being able to see who the police were, who the motorist being pulled over was, in terms of level of respect, from highly respectful to very disrespectful and hostile, right? And in doing this, she accumulated a whole set of values for what people consider to be respectful and disrespectful or hostile interaction between police and motorists. And then she fed this into a complicated AI algorithm and analyzed hundreds of thousands of body camera interactions and came to the conclusion that for white Americans, the police are respectful in the first minutes of their interaction with the motorist about 90% of the time. And that for African Americans, that's about 30% of the time. And that for the 70% of disrespectful interactions between police and motorists who happen to be African American, that it quickly escalates into hostility. And one of the things that we know is when you treat somebody with disrespect and hostility, it increases their fear, it increases the likelihood that the situation will escalate. So this is not conclusive proof, but I think it contributes to the idea that the reason that the police are killing African Americans at 3 times the rate that they're killing whites is not because of the way in which African Americans are comporting themselves in the interactions. It's because of the way in which the police regard Black motorists as potentially violent criminals, despite the fact that they're no more likely. And by the way, this is something, implicit bias, the association of African American males in particular with criminality that is so deeply rooted in our culture, in our upbringing, in the implicit psychological scaffolding or conceptual frameworks that our parents transmit to us, that it's practically ubiquitous in our society. It shows up no matter who you study. So we then turn to the question, okay, so there's much more police violence against Blacks than whites. Are they accountable for this violence? And the answer is no. 99% of the time, they are not charged when they kill African Americans. This is from 2013 to 2019. And in the 1% of the time that they are charged, they're very rarely convicted, less than a quarter of the time, right? And so the sense that there is a kind of impunity here, right? And there's a whole legal doctrine that shelters the police from liability for the violence that they do, gives, I think, further credence to Alexander's suggestion that criminal justice has replaced white vigilanteism. And in a sense, white vigilanteism has morphed into the way in which the criminal justice system operates in the United States. We see further evidence of this, right? She speaks in her title of mass incarceration. People talk about this as a crisis, and for understandable reasons, right? This is the data on the number of Americans in the prison system. The United States now has the highest per capita rate of incarceration of any society in the world. And please note that it starts in the mid to late 70s. This is when California passes the 3 strikes and you're out bill. This is then the crack cocaine epidemic and the imposition of mandatory sentencing on judges so that they don't get to exercise any discretion. There's the rapid federalization of 3 strikes and you're out. And there's this huge ballooning of the population imprisoned in the United States. And just so we're clear, right, the incarceration rate is not moving in tandem with the rates of violent crime or property crime, right? They did accelerate somewhat in the 70s and again in the 80s, but then they have decreased steadily. They may be going up again now. It's a little hard to know with the data for sure, but there does seem to be some good evidence that violent crime is increasing in the United States, especially during the pandemic, but there doesn't seem to be any real relation between the rate of incarceration and the rate of crime. Now, when we look at the incarceration rate by race, we see that African Americans are 5 times as likely to be incarcerated as white Americans are. And that's despite the fact, right, that there are equal number of crimes, roughly speaking, committed by Blacks and whites in our society. I think I've mentioned to you before the reforms that were undertaken when a new district attorney was elected in Madison, Wisconsin, and he told all of his subordinates, we need to have equal rates of prosecution of Blacks and whites. He actually fired some people, hired some new people who were committed to this, brought in some Black prosecutors. And then did an internal study 2 years later and found essentially that they were still prosecuting Blacks far more frequently than whites. And that the implicit bias that police officers are showing, prosecutors are showing, judges are showing, juries are showing, it's endemic to our criminal justice system. You add to that the vast majority of people who are charged with a crime in the United States do not have a trial, but instead are subject to a plea bargain, and that there's very good evidence that the pleas that are offered to whites are more lenient than the pleas that are offered to Blacks. And you begin to see, apologies for the lack of focus here, but that the length of time served by Black men is 20% higher than the length of time served by white men who commit the same crime, right? And so part of the reason there's such a higher rate of incarceration is not only because more people are being pursued by the police, more people are being prosecuted, more people are being convicted, but even when the white people are convicted, they're getting less time than the Blacks. So they're out of prison, out of the criminal justice system quicker. When we look at the rates of conviction, right? Blacks 7 times as likely to be convicted of murder, 12 times as likely to be convicted of drug crimes. And again, the idea that this is an underlying issue to do with different rates of criminality has no credibility. This is actually a diagram of innocent people who were convicted, right? So the whites were innocent, the Blacks were innocent. The Blacks are 7 to 12 times more likely to be wrongfully convicted than white people are. Finally, in terms of explaining some of the outrage that poured onto the streets in the summer of 2020, the sad fact is that there are reforms that people like Jennifer Eberhardt have identified that when implemented do reduce the level of police violence and killings. And to be as clear as possible, right? These reforms do not involve telling the police officers, don't be racist, don't see race, don't pay attention to the race of the person you're apprehending. That doesn't work. The problem with implicit bias is we're not even aware of the way in which it is shaping our cognition and, even more importantly, our emotional reaction in the situation. The triggering of our fight or flight system, which is a pre-conscious system, which makes it much more difficult for us to think clearly, much more likely that we're going to react with violence. If, on the other hand, we become aware that that's what's going on and that there are behavioral measures we can take that will allow us to not act in ways that we will ultimately regret or rationalize, that is the path to reform. So we require officers to use all other means before shooting. That reduces fatalities by 25%. We require all use of force to be reported by other police officers. Derek Chauvin's colleagues, fellow police officers, stood by while he murdered George Floyd. Again, that reduces by 25% the rate of police-caused fatality. Banning chokeholds, strangleholds, down 20%. Having a use of force continuum, right? Don't go straight for the gun, go for the taser, go for the baton first. Requiring de-escalation, right? And recognizing that your conduct may escalate the reaction of the person that you're interacting with, and trying to step back and say, wait a minute, I think there's a misunderstanding, or I'm sorry, let's try to reset, reduces deaths by 15%. And we see this in the data when we compare states that have reform with states that don't have reform. 6 times as likely to be killed in Oklahoma than Georgia, because Georgia has statewide training to prevent police violence. In Buffalo, the police force was very similar, the population very similar, the racial composition very similar, the rate of violent crime very similar, but in the early 2000s, the Buffalo Police Department entered a consent decree and went under this training and went to having 0 police deaths from 2013 to 2016. Orlando, nearly identical in terms of its demographic profile, didn't undergo the training, and they killed 13 people in exactly that same time frame. So I think the evidence is very clear that reform works, and part of the anger spilling out into the streets is, if we know reform works, if we know Black people are being killed and jailed disproportionately, why are we not doing something about it, right? And I want finally to point out that the summer of 2020 was a potential inflection point in American attitudes about police and race in American society. And as you can see, in June of 2020, as we processed collectively the killing of George Floyd and the detailed evidence to what a clear map of racial subordination it presented us, what we saw is that actually trust for Black Lives Matter exceeded trust for law enforcement. First time ever that had shown up in public opinion research. Very short-lived, right? And by the late summer of 2020, certainly by the spring of 2021, trust for law enforcement has gone back up, trust for Black Lives Matter has gone back down, and there's now again a 19-point gap. If we look at this just in terms of support for Black Lives Matter, what we see is that African Americans have been highly supportive of this movement for the last 3 years, and that in the summer of 2020, that support spiked a little bit. There wasn't much room for it to go up, but it did go up. Whereas white Americans, and the top line is those who oppose, the bottom dotted line is those who support, right? You can see, obviously, white Americans as a whole have less approval, more opposition to Black Lives Matter, yet for a couple months in the summer of 2020, white support actually exceeds white opposition, and then very quickly it snaps back to the old pattern. And here is, I think, the next thing to notice, and that is, why did this happen? And here I think we have to look at what was happening in particular in the right-wing media ecosystem. And so this diagram compares the rate at which protesting was mentioned on 3 of the most widely watched news networks in the United States, CNN, MSNBC, and Fox. And as you can see, roughly comparable rates of mentioning protesting. But when we look at looting and rioting, what we see is that Fox is at more than double the rate of CNN and MSNBC, at points more than 5 times the rate of mentioning this. And this is clearly a filter that's being applied to the news, paying much more attention to rioting and looting, which is anomalous. It is lamentable. It is certainly worthy of covering. And CNN and MSNBC are covering it, but they're not emphasizing it in the way that Fox is. Fox is trying to shape public opinion, to reshape public opinion, so that it will be less sympathetic to Black Lives Matter, more sympathetic to police. Now, as an aside for a moment, you may have seen a judge a couple days ago sentencing a person who invaded the Capitol on January 6th indicated that he thought a certain amount of leniency was in order because the person who he was sentencing he regarded to be a pawn. And he didn't mention former President Donald Trump by name, but he clearly indicated that political leaders who knew better had encouraged the crowd to march on the Capitol, hoping that they would do exactly what they did and recognizing that they would bear no responsibility for it, that the members of the crowd, on the other hand, would be potentially subject to criminal prosecution. And I think this is an important perspective to bring to bear on Kyle Rittenhouse as well, right? Kyle Rittenhouse is watching right-wing media. He's part of right-wing social media circles. We don't have the evidence for what's going on in social media, but you can bet that it's something similar to this. Hopefully, eventually, we will be able to gather the data on that. I have not seen it yet, but these are then the frames that lead somebody like Kyle Rittenhouse to go to Kenosha armed, thinking that they need to enforce law and order, that it's incumbent upon them to stand in for law enforcement. And again, I just want to be as clear as possible that when we look at the change in public opinion, we can't separate it from what's going on in the media. Now, have there been reforms as a result of the protests of summer 2020? There have been some, and some meaningful reforms, right? And so chokeholds are now banned in 60 of the largest 100 cities in the United States, up from 30 before these protests. Strangleholds, also dramatic increase. But other of the reforms recommended, right, de-escalation or use of force continuum, although use of force was already very much in effect in many cities, there was not as much an increase. And here's, I think, the really important thing to see, which is to say that police reform is primarily occurring in blue states and really not occurring in red states, right? And so again, if we think about this in terms of the broader context of racial justice, the racial order of the United States, racial asymmetries in law enforcement, we have reason to be concerned that the protests of summer 2020 did not do all the work that we needed them to do. All right, so why don't I stop for a moment?
Yes, yeah.
And as always, I'm saying it too late, but I welcome you to comment whenever you want to. You don't have to wait for me to stop, but it sounds like you're ready to go, Flossie. Go ahead.
I am certain the next time we have an election in 24, not this election, that Kyle Rittenhouse will be running for some kind of office. I think you can count on it. I can also argue that because he's a 17-year-old, he's 18 now.
I expected to.
But wait, I'm talking now. Wait, please.
I think it's deliberate, Flossie.
Yes. He was 17 when he shot two people and injured another. And very much the product of his times. It's Kenosha, it's Wisconsin. He felt that right. You can argue that he didn't really understand what he was doing. But I think that the defense attorneys knew that, and they knew that this was a kid who could turn on the tears. He is already an actor and a very good actor, I think. And the defense attorneys wouldn't have put him on the stand, as they argue, unless they knew that he would tell the truth. I invert that. They knew that this was a young man who probably did the wrong thing, who probably was conditioned that way, but he was a young man who could get away without telling the whole truth. And he will be a very good politician. That's all.
Yeah. That seems to be a prerequisite of success in American politics on both sides of the aisle right now. Now,
Yes.
let me focus for a minute on the trial. And so obviously Rittenhouse got good defense attorneys, right? It was funded from the outside. And on the other hand, I think it's worthwhile noting the prosecution called a bunch of witnesses who ultimately seemed to help the defense, right? And in the way in which, the law permitted Kyle Rittenhouse to bring an assault rifle to a protest, in the way in which the self-defense statute of the state of Wisconsin is written, I think that it's entirely possible that this was the right outcome. And please note, right, we don't build our judicial system to make sure that every guilty person is convicted. We build it to make sure that no innocent person is convicted. And as I showed you, there are a lot of innocent people in jail in the United States today. This is not working the way it should, but I do think we want to maintain that presumption, that burden, that preponderance, that standard. So we have to then reconcile ourselves to the fact that the result of having the presumption of innocence in our legal system is that some people whose conduct we find reprehensible will not be convicted. Having said all of that, I think I want to change focus away from Kyle Rittenhouse, who you rightly note is a 17-year-old, and focus for a minute on the social and cultural milieu he comes from. And here again, I'm drawing on Jonathan Metzl and the idea of gun culture in the United States. I can't remember the name of the town in Missouri that Metzl goes and visits, but he says he cannot find a person in the entire region who is not packing, who is not wearing a gun, who doesn't have a concealed weapon. Many of them have multiple guns. And so I'm speaking to you in an area where gun culture really is driven out of the mainstream, right? But I think we've got to also recognize that Rittenhouse is a product of
Absolutely.
broader cultural milieu, not just making decisions on his own. And that, as I said, right, these guns are ultimately trained on their own owners, right? It is the owner and the family members of the owners of these guns who are most likely to be killed by them, right? And so there's a deeper argument to be had here about gun safety, about sane gun laws. I don't think you need to attack gun culture altogether to suggest that you don't need to have assault rifles in the hands
Exactly.
of
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or be provocative too. He was, looking for a fight.
Yeah. And he did provoke, right? All right. And anybody else with a question or comment at this juncture? So give me a moment to preview where I'm going to go with you next week and maybe the week after, because I started out saying that I want to try to suggest that from a long-term perspective, there's some good trends that should lead us to be a little bit more optimistic and a little bit more hopeful about American politics. And then I didn't talk with you about that at all. And I do need more time to develop these themes, so I won't be developing them at length today. But I at least want to leave you with a teaser of where I hope to go. And of course, the Rittenhouse verdict has kind of crowded out, or at least distracted from the other big thing that happened in American politics yesterday, and that is that the House passed a version of Biden's Build Back Better bill. And that doesn't mean it's going to sail through the Senate. Far from it. It does increase the likelihood that it will, some version of it will ultimately pass the Senate. And if it does, that means that in the first year of Biden's presidency, he passed a major coronavirus stimulus package, a major infrastructure package, and a major safety net package, an expansion of the federal government of a kind that we haven't seen in several generations, right? And to be clear, I also think it's very likely that the Democrats will lose the Congress in 2022, in part as a result of their legislative successes of 2021, right? And so that's the short term, long term. And to just be very brief about this, in the coming weeks, I want to talk with you about two books, one of which I've already recommended to you, Heather McGhee's The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. Heather McGhee is the former head of the public policy research group, Demos, and then Robert Putnam, one of the most esteemed political scientists writing on American politics in the United States today, of Harvard University, former dean of the Kennedy School of Government, and his recently published book, The Upswing, How America Came Together a Century Ago and How We Can Do It Again. And what I want to emphasize from these two books is 2 points that I think are together very important. The first is that the racial demographics of the country are changing, and that as they change, it is going to be traumatic. It's going to be difficult for at least some white people to surrender their numerical advantage and the privilege that came with it. But that ultimately, I think this is going to lead to greater interracial cooperation, and then a greater capacity to govern, cooperate, and share in the burdens of solving our collective problems together. And then Putnam calls our attention to the fact that we like to think of the middle of the 20th century as extremely important in terms of the expansion of the welfare state, the contraction of income and wealth inequality, the growth of solidarity. But he points out that it couldn't have happened without the tumultuous political battles of the late 19th and early 20th century, and that as the progressive movement at the state level, at the local level, every now and then in national politics began to make some headway, very frequently it got pushed back. But eventually it transformed the United States. And I just want to emphasize that from the long-term historical perspective, what looks to us here and now like perhaps a really awful low point with dangerously violent tendencies in contemporary American politics may turn out to be laying the foundation for a more progressive, conciliatory, cooperative era in American politics to come. So that's the preview of the more hopeful stuff I'm going to try to share with you over the next couple weeks. I'll say happy Thanksgiving to everyone, and I will see you the day after Black Friday. Take care, everyone. Good being with you again.
Thank you, David.
My pleasure. Thank you, guys. Talk to you soon. Have good weeks and good holidays. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.